Chapter 18 of Colonel Quaritch, V.C. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Colonel Quaritch, V.C. by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 18. What Some Have Found So Sweet. Time went on. Mr. Quest had been back at Boisingham for 10 days or more, and was in better spirits than Bella, we can no longer call her his wife, had seen him in for years. Indeed, he felt as though 10 years had been lifted off his back. He had taken a great and terrible decision and had acted upon it, and it had been successful, for he knew that his evil genius was so thoroughly terrified that for a long while at least he would be free from her persecutions. But with Bella his relations remained as strained as ever. Now that the reader is in the secret of Mr. Quest's life, it will perhaps help him to understand the apparent strangeness of his conduct with reference to his wife and Edward Cossey. It is quite true that Bella did not know the full extent of her husband's guilt. She did not know that he was not her husband, but she did know that nearly all of her little fortune had been paid over to another woman, and that woman a common, vulgar woman, as one of Edith's letters, which had fallen into her hands by chance, very clearly showed her. Therefore, had he attempted to expose her proceedings, or even to control her actions, she had in her hand an effective weapon of defence, wherewith she could and would have given blow for blow. This state of affairs of necessity forced each party to preserve an armed neutrality toward the other, whilst they waited for a suitable opportunity to assert themselves. Not that their objects were quite the same. Bella merely wished to be free of her husband, whom she had always disliked, and whom she now positively hated, with that curious hatred which women occasionally conceive towards those whom they are legally bound, when they have been bad enough or unfortunate enough to fall in love with somebody else. He, on the contrary, had that desire for revenge upon her which even the gentler stamp of man is apt to conceive toward one who, herself the object of his strong affection, daily and hourly repels and repays it with scorn and infidelity. He did love her truly. She was the one living thing in all his bitter, lonely life to whom his heart had gone out. True, he put pressure on her to marry him, or, what comes to the same thing, allowed and encouraged her drunken old father to do so. But he had loved her and still loved her, and yet she mocked at him, and in the face of that fact about the money, her money, which he had paid away to the other woman, a fact which it was impossible for him to explain except by the admission of guilt which would be his ruin, what was he to urge to convince her of this, even had she been open to conviction? But it was bitter to him, bitter beyond all conception, to have this, the one joy of his life, snatched from him. He threw himself with ardour into the pursuit after wealth and dignity of position, partly because he had a legitimate desire for these things, and partly to assuage the constant irritation of his mind, but to no purpose. These two spectres of his existence, his tiger wife and the fair woman who was his wife in name, constantly marched side by side before him, blotting out the beauty from every scene and souring the sweetness of every joy. But if in his pain he thirsted for revenge upon Bella, who would have none of him, how much more did he desire to be avenged upon Edward Cossey, who, as it were, had in sheer wantonness robbed him of the one good thing he had. It made him mad to think that this man, to whom he knew himself to be in every way superior, should have the power thus to injure him, and he longed to pay him back measure for measure, and through his heart's affections to strike him as mortal a blow as he had himself received. Mr. Quest was no doubt a bad man. His whole life was a fraud. He was selfish and unscrupulous in his schemes and relentless in their execution. But whatever may have been the measure of his iniquities, he was not doomed to wait for another world to have them meted out to him again. His life, indeed, was full of miseries, the more keenly felt because of the high pitch and capacity of his nature, and perhaps the sharpest of them all was the sickening knowledge that it had not been for that one fatal error of his boyhood, that one false step down the steep of Avernus, he might have been a good and even a great man. Just now, however, his load was a little lightened, and he was able to devote himself to his money-making and to the weaving of the web that was to destroy his rival, Edward Cossey, with a mind a little less preoccupied with other cares. Meanwhile, things at the castle were going very pleasantly for everybody. The squire was as happy in attending to the various details connected with the transfer of the mortgages as though he had been lending £30,000 instead of borrowing it. The great George was happy in the unaccustomed flow of borrowed cash that enabled him to treat Janter with a lofty scorn not unmingled with pity, which was as balm to his harassed soul, and also to transact an enormous amount of business in his own peculiar way with men up trees and otherwise, for he had not to stock the Moat Farm, and was not Michaelmas at hand. Ida too was happy, happier than she had been since her brother's death, for reasons that have already been hinted at. Besides, Mr. Edward Cossey was out of the way, and that to Ida was a very great thing, for his presence to her was what a policeman is to a ticket of leave man, a most unpleasant and suggestive sight. She fully realised the meaning and extent of the bargain into which she had entered to save her father and her house, and there lay upon her the deep shadow of evil that was to come. Every time she saw her father bustling about with his business letters and his parchments, every time the universal George arrived with an air of melancholy satisfaction and a long list of the farming stock and implements he had bought at some neighbouring Michaelmas sale, the shadow deepened, and she heard the clanking of her chains. Therefore she was the more thankful for her respite. Harold Quaritch was happy too, though in a somewhat restless and peculiar way. Mrs. Jobson, the old lady who attended to his wants at Molehill with the help of a gardener and a simple village maid, her niece, who smashed all the crockery and nearly drove the Colonel mad by banging the doors, shifting his papers and even dusting his trays of Roman coins, actually confided to some friends in the village that she thought the poor dear gentleman was going mad. When questioned on what she based this belief, she replied that he would walk up and down the oak-panelled dining room by the hour together, that then, when he got tired of that exercise, whereby, said Mrs. Jobson, he had already worn a groove in the new Turkey carpet, he would take out a rocky, foggy looking bit of a picture and set it upon a chair and stare at it through his fingers, shaking his head and muttering all the while. Then, further and conclusive proof of a yielding intellect, he would get a half sheet of paper with some writing on it and put it on the mantelpiece and stare at that. Next he would turn it upside down and stare at it so, then sideways, then all ways. Then he would hold it before a looking-glass and stare at the looking-glass, and so on. When asked how she knew all this, she confessed that Jane had seen it through the keyhole, not once, but often. Of course, as the practised and discerning reader will clearly understand, this meant only that when walking and wearing out the carpet, the Colonel was thinking of Ida. When contemplating the painting she had given him, he was admiring her work and trying to reconcile his admiration with his conscience and his somewhat peculiar views of art, and that when glaring at the paper he was vainly endeavouring to make head or tail of the message written to his son on the night before his execution by Sir James de la Mole in the reign of Charles I, and confidently believed by Ida to contain a key to the whereabouts of the treasure he was supposed to have secreted. Of course, the tale of this worthy soul, Mrs. Jobson, did not lose in the telling, and when it reached Ida's ears, which it did at last, through the medium of George, for in addition to his numberless and other functions, George was the sole authorised purveyor of village and country news, it read that Colonel Quaritch had gone raving mad. 10 minutes afterward this raving lunatic arrived at the castle in his dress clothes and his right mind, whereupon Ida promptly repeated her thrilling history, somewhat to the subsequent discomfort of Mrs. Jobson and Jane. No one, as somebody once said with equal truth and profundity, knows what a minute may bring forth, much less, therefore, does anybody know what an evening of, say, 240 minutes may produce. For instance,